All right. So we have three criticisms of the Empire Writes Back. It is taken for granted. Now you know the background to the Empire Writes Back and what is the major argument or what is the main focus of the Empire Writes Back. So now, what is the first one? One is it does not address the gender differences. Is not speaking anything about the women's experience in the colonies. So, according to this group of critics, this whole book, The Empire Writes Back, is being very, very general and they are seeing everything from the male perspective. They are not trying to understand and they are not addressing the women's, or you could say the difference between the genders. So, there is a neglect of gender differences between writers. So, they are not taking care of what the women in these colonies would have experienced. And why do they say that? Because men and women, they don't live post coloniality in the same way. That is, the experiences of post colonial land or post colonialism is not experienced in the same manner by men as well as women. So gender is also very important when it comes to experiencing something. So as a man, the world is different to you, and as a woman, world is different to you, right? So this is not taken into consideration by the authors. So now, this difference between the male experience and the female experience, this actually affects a writer's relationship to language. Even language affects gender. For instance, the kind of language that is used by women and about women are different comparing to the language of men, used by men and about men. So, and already we have seen how language is a lethal weapon. It is a lethal weapon that can be used to subjugate, dominate, colonize. So women themselves have been at the receiving end when it comes to language used by a patriarchal society. So that doesn't get reflected here. And then it does not account for class differences also. So this study is like a blanket study wherein every person is supposed to experience post-colonialism in the same manner. So many important social facts of writer's identity are passed over by the authors. That is, authors are not, that is, these critics of the Empire Writes Back, they are not really worried about the writer's social identity. But actually, when you try to understand a particular work, you need to understand the writer also and the writer's background. So, writer's background, as in his or her gender, then the kind of socio-economic, political, and cultural baggage that he or she comes with. These things are not actually studied in detail by the authors. So these gender and class differences is a big issue when it comes to the generalizing made by the Empire Writes Back. So these individual social and gender differences are not studied. The other one is national differences. See, post-colonialism is experienced by different countries in different manners. Some countries became free much earlier, whereas some got their freedom very late. Then again, you have places like, the settler colonies, for instance, Australia, Canada. There, you can talk about post-colonialism. Yes, they became free from the British, but within those countries, we have the native people. For instance, in New Zealand, you have the Maori people, and then you have the American subcontinent, where you have the Red Indians and the other tribes. What about them? For them, the white people who still continue to be there, they are neo-colonial and not post-colonial. They have not yet become post-colonial because they are still living with white people who are oppressing them. So can you have a blanket term or a kind of a blanket study which speaks about post-colonialism in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and compare that with India? That's not possible. So there is little attempt to differentiate within or between writings from very different nations. And colonialism, as we know, did not happen in the same manner in different countries. Again, writing from different countries with different historical and cultural relationships with the center cannot be assumed to function in the same manner. That is the kind of relationship these different countries had with their colonizer, and the kind of you could say equation between them is not the same, and the way they left the country or they became free, some in some countries freedom was achieved without much bloodshed, whereas in some countries it was really bad. So these things actually flavor what is happening in the national consciousness, right? So these differences are not accounted for by the writers in their work. So again, you have things like Maori people in New Zealand, or people in the different ex colonies of America. What about them? What about them? For them, the world has not become post-colonial. For them, it is not. It's just a continuation. It's just neo-colonial. So the Britishers have gone, but then the white people are settled there. They are actually subjugating them, right? So for them, it is an experience of neo-colonialism rather than post-colonial. So you cannot really talk about post-colonial in those contexts. And the final one is this writing back. This writing back, as in appropriating the language of the center, changing it, making it more malleable, and using it to our own advantage to speak about our own sensibilities. Is this prevalent in all the colonies? That's a question. So, can we assume that all writings from ex colonies are against colonial discourses? So, every novel that comes out of these colonies, are they all post colonial? They are talking against the colonial discourse. Can we generalize that? There are so many other writers who are writing about things that doesn't have any direct bearing on the post-colonial, or sorry, the colonial. And we can't assume that all the writings from countries with the history of colonialism is mainly concerned with colonial history, colonial discourses, and decolonizing the mind. So this is wrong. We cannot assume. For instance, can you give the names of some writers who don't have anything to do with colonial discourses or colonial history or decolonizing the mind? Indian writers. Can you think of someone? Can't think of anybody. What about most of our present day writers? Think about Chetan Bhagat, your pop fiction writer. Has he got anything to do with any of these topics? Nothing. So we cannot generalize that writing back is prevalent and all the works coming out of the colonies are against colonial discourses. So what are the three criticisms? One is that gender and class is not taken into account. The second one is there's obviously difference between the different countries and the experiences, and then again you cannot use the term post-colonial everywhere because it is problematic. Why is it problematic? Because in countries like New Zealand, Canada, Australia, wherein you have the native people who are still being colonized by the white settlers there, so for them it is a case of neo-colonialism rather than post-colonialism. So using that terminology for every ex-colony is actually problematic. And finally, this phenomena or this understanding that all the nations, all the ex colonies are actually writing back to the center cannot be generalized, because not every writer from these different colonies are really worried or talking about the colonial discourse or the post colonial discourse or decolonizing or the colonial history. They have other concerns. There are other issues and problems also that are being discussed and deliberated upon. Does this make sense?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.